Hi, my name's Nicole Westmarland. I'm a Professor of Criminology at Durham University and I'm Director of the Durham Centre for Research into Violence and Abuse. I've worked on a number of projects, around 40 different projects on different forms of men's violence against women, particularly domestic and sexual violence. Also worked in the voluntary sector, including being Chair of Rape Crisis England and Wales for about 5 years. Today I'm going to be talking about some recent research which we did into domestic violence perpetrator programmes called Project Mirabal. This is the report that I'm going to be talking about, and at the end there'll be a link where you can download the report if you want to read more about it. So the title of my presentation today is Beyond Safety, Findings from UK's Project Mirabal across 6 new measures of success. And I did this work with Professor Liz Kelly at London Metropolitan University, and we were funded by the ESRC and the Northern Rock Foundation. So in terms of the story so far, the work that's been done, we started this research around about 5 years ago, around about 2010. And what we found at that point was widespread scepticism from lots of different directions about the ability for men who use violence within relationships to be able to change. And that was from police, from feminist activists, from domestic violence practitioners, from lots of different angles. And what we also found was that domestic violence perpetrator programmes were held to much more intense scrutiny than other responses. So we found that a lot of the time when people were looking for funding to either continue work with violent men or to set up new interventions, that they were subject to kind of this scepticism and intense scrutiny. So often the conversation would be, well, how do you know whether it works or not? Where is your evidence? In a way that I think isn't asked of a lot of other interventions. And there was often the assumption that it would have to work all the time as well. So often people had an example, a single example of, well, I know a man or I know a woman whose partner went on a programme and they didn't stop being violent. And these kind of single incidents of a programme not being successful were used as examples for them not being useful. And we also sometimes give the example of, well, paracetamol, we don't take a paracetamol and on one occasion it doesn't work and say that it doesn't work at all. And we felt that, we were expecting, there was a very high expectation that domestic violence perpetrator programmes always had to completely change men, had to end every man's violence and abuse within relationships for them to be worthwhile to do. And internationally, there's certainly no research that shows that this does happen, nor would we expect this to happen. And research, particularly in America, is where most of the big studies have been done so far until ours. Research has showed very mixed results. So some research shows that domestic violence perpetrator programmes, or as they call them in the States, batterer intervention programmes, some research shows that they have no effect compared with a comparison group, and some research shows that it has a marginal effect, a small effect on improvements. But the research in the UK is limited, very limited. In fact, in terms of outcome research, it's limited to one study in Scotland around about 15 years ago by Rebecca and Russell Dobash and others. And they looked at, they compared men who were sentenced by a criminal court. They compared men who were sentenced to a domestic violence perpetrator programme compared to men who were given a different type of criminal justice outcome, for example, a fine or a community order. And they found a marginal improvement for the men who were given the domestic violence perpetrator programme condition. So we've got very limited research in the UK, but what we do have has tended to be fairly positive. And it's really important that we look at the UK specifically and don't just rely on the US research, because we have a very UK specific model of domestic violence perpetrator programmes here in the UK. So whether the programme is inside or outside the criminal justice system, for example, there is the requirement that there is women's safety and support workers attached to programs, and that's fairly unique across both Europe and the rest of the world to have this model. And we're really unusual, and many would say lucky, to have an organisation like Respect in the UK, which works at improving standards and works at looking at comparability across perpetrator programs and looks for increasing safe practice for women and children. And that, again, is something which is very unique to the UK, and something which a lot of other countries are actually trying to implement themselves. Okay, so Project Mirabal, it was a broad and long programme of research. So we've been doing it for a long time, around about 5 years, and it's broad in that it's got lots of different elements to it. I'm not going to be able to talk about all of the elements today, but there is much more in the research report, and there'll be a website at the end of this presentation which also links to other publications from our research. It was named after the Mirabal sisters, who were assassinated in Latin America, who were opposing a dictatorship. The Mirabal sisters were the impetus for the UN Day of Action for Violence Against Women in November, and it's them that we named our research project after. And the main aim was to understand what domestic violence perpetrator programs can contribute to coordinated community approaches to domestic violence. So we weren't looking at this thing of does a men's program work? Does a domestic violence perpetrator program work on its own? We didn't want to get into a question of kind of should resources go to men's programs, to women's support services, etc. Our starting point is that you already have other services working in a coordinated approach to domestic violence. So you already have women's services, you already have services for children, you've got a range of services. What difference does adding a men's programme make to that response? This isn't an either-or situation as far as we're concerned. So today I'm going to specifically talk about the change, the way that we measured change amongst the men on the non-criminal justice system domestic violence perpetrator programs. So these weren't men who were ordered to go on a program by a criminal court. These were men who were on a program for a different reason. Sometimes people call them voluntary programs, but that's a little bit of a misnomer. Community programs is a slightly better term to use. The reason why we don't like voluntary is because a lot of the men weren't truly volunteering to go on the program. They were often heavily suggested to go by children's services. They might have been going because they had to go for them to regain some form of child contact or to increase their child contact, or they may have been told to go by their partner. Either you go on this program or the relationship is over. So there was a lot of different reasons why the men were on the programs. Just as a side point, the Istanbul Convention, which the UK is now a signatory to but hasn't yet ratified, but this is the European instrument for reducing domestic violence and violence against women and girls, and they have a specific part within this that says that states should be setting up programs such as these, and that they should be doing these in close coordination with specialist services for victims. So I just throw that in to show that this is very much something which across Europe at a European level is of interest to the EU, and which states are increasingly being pushed towards doing. So we started our research back in 2010 with what we call the What Counts as Success study. And this was because often when funders and commissioners were saying, well, where's the evidence? How do we know it works? The next question was, well, what do you mean by whether it works? So we wanted to look at what counts as success. A lot of the previous research programs, particularly those in the US and particularly kind of older studies, tended to just look, has there been any more violence? If there had been one more incident of violence, then that was it, that they weren't classed as a success. And we wanted to kind of look at broader measures of success that were actually really in line with the people who were involved in the programme, particularly, Liz Kelly and I's long-standing research, more so Liz's than mine, in terms of what we knew about women who were living with violent and abusive men. And we knew from that it wasn't just about the single incidents of violence. It was so much more than that. So that's where we wanted to start off with, extending definitions of what we mean by success when we have an intervention that is designed to reduce that. So we did 73 interviews with women and men who were linked to domestic violence perpetrator programmes, so the women partners and ex-partners of the men on the programme, and with programme staff and with commissioners as well. And we wanted to look at domestic violence as it is lived, as a pattern of coercive, controlling behaviours. And this is why, I titled this presentation Beyond Safety. We weren't just interested in safety for women and children. We also wanted to know about freedom for women and children. And this was very much reflected in what we thought we knew, what Evan Stark has found in the US, and in women's own definitions of success. So what did we find? We found 6 different measures of success. The first was around an improved relationship, which is underpinned by respect and effective communication. Second, for partners and ex-partners to have an expanded space for action, the life space that they have, which empowers them to be able to use their voice, make their own choices, improve their well-being, to be able to have that freedom. Measure 3, the one which is usually the only measure within evaluations such as this, safety and freedom from violence and abuse for women and children. Very important, but often not the first thing which women were saying actually. Measure 4, safe, positive and shared parenting. Enhanced awareness of self and others for men on programmes, including an understanding of the impact that the domestic violence had had. That was very important, again, particularly to women who were saying, I want them to understand the damage that they've done to the family. I want them to know the harms that they've caused to the children. And finally, measure 6 for children, safer, healthier childhoods in which they felt heard and cared about. Very important to some of the commissioners in particular, that measure. But all of those measures were important in different ways to the men on programmes, the partners and ex-partners, funders and commissioners, and the staff on programmes. And our overall kind of hypothesis was actually that coercive control, increasing women's freedom, would actually probably be more difficult than actual incidents of physical violence to change. But it's really important if women and children are to be no longer walking on eggshells. This term, I felt like I was walking on eggshells all the time, came up time and time again from the women in this study, and also from what we've heard time and time again from our experience within the women's sector and doing other programmes like this. So to us, actually, reducing violence wasn't enough. That wasn't just what we were looking at. We were asking a much wider question. And this was partly based on the most recent study at the time we were starting in the US by Ed Gondolf. And his work showed very importantly that perpetrator programmes didn't just sit within a vacuum, that this wider coordinated community response was really, really important for outcomes. I mean, actually, in theory, it's actually possible for a perpetrator programme to be increasing women and children's safety without actually changing that individual man's behaviour. Just because if you've got men's workers who are working in a coordinated way with women's safety workers, with a wider community response, for example, being at MARAC or being at child contact hearings and being able to have input, even if it is just to say that this man is continuing to be unsafe and he is continuing to use his violent behaviour, then that in itself is a very important input to a coordinated community response. And many studies were also many researchers were also looking for more holistic studies, not just do men change? But how does this change happen? How can this knowledge about perpetrators influence the wider intervention system? We won't be able to talk so much about that today because of timing, but these are questions which we are going to be continuing writing about as time goes on. So our research question was, what do they contribute to coordinated community responses to domestic violence? So just very briefly, our research design, we did longitudinal telephone survey with 100 women whose partners or ex-partners had attended a programme. We also did it with 62 women whose partners had not attended a programme, but when we came to compare those two samples, unfortunately, they were too different for us to draw comparisons. So that was a limitation to our research, and it's just the 100 women that I'm going to be talking about today. And we asked them about the levels of violence and abuse and how they were with the children, etc. All of the 6 measures of success. We asked questions about that before the programme, then we asked every 3 months up until 12 months after the start date. 5 interviews covering 6 time points. So by the 12 months, everybody had finished the programme. We don't say we don't use the language of kind of 3 months after finishing, because we actually drew our sample from 12 domestic violence perpetrator programmes across the UK. It's a multi-site study, and the programmes were slightly different lengths. So that's why we use the terminology 12 months after the start date. We also did longitudinal in-depth interviews with 64 men on programmes, 48 partners or ex-partners, and we did those interviews, one near the beginning and one near the end of the programme. I'm going to be drawing on some of that data today as well. We did interviews with domestic violence perpetrator programme staff and stakeholders. We looked at the impact on children by doing an online survey, interviews with staff. We used a specially designed research book to do interviews with 13 children aged 7 to 16. And we looked at programme integrity as well. Again, more interviews and a 6-month ethnographic study as well. And those two are published separately, the impact on children, the actual words of the children and pictures that the children drew, and the stuff on programme integrity as well. Because they were 2 attached PhDs by Sue Alderson and Ruth Phillips. So our research sample, it was 12 respect accredited domestic violence perpetrator programmes, geographically diverse, spanning much of England, 1 in Wales, 1 in Scotland. Sometimes they were standalone projects, sometimes they were within charities such as Barnardo's. And a comparison group was drawn, but as I said, this was the part of the study which didn't really work as a very good comparison. We found that the women who were attending the Freedom Programme were very different in terms of where they were with their relationship than the women whose partners or ex-partners were attending domestic violence perpetrator programmes, and particularly that at the start point, the women who were attending Freedom Programme were very likely already to be separated from their partner, whereas a lot of the women who were in the intervention group, whose partners were attending the perpetrator programme, were together with their partners near the beginning. Actually, quite a number, in fact more, of the intervention group separated during our research than they did in the comparison group. But because they were different at the start, that meant it was problematic to use them as a comparison. Similarly, in terms of children, a lot of the there wasn't child contact in a lot of cases, but in our comparison group, so the women who were attending the Freedom Programme, that tended to be through a choice that the father was making not to have contact with the child, whereas in the intervention group, the men attending the domestic violence perpetrator programme, this was most often contested child contact. So often they did want contact, but either the mother, the child, or CAFCAS deemed it not safe for that contact to take place. So that there was more often contested child contact, which meant that that they weren't comparison. Okay, let me move on to the findings. So our main headline finding was that for the majority of women whose partners and ex-partners attended a domestic violence perpetrator programme, the physical and sexual violence stopped almost completely. So if you look at this chart, you see that the pale blue is the baseline. So this is 3 months before they went on the programme. And the darker, the royal blue, is 12 months after they started the programme. So you see a very common pattern. All of them reduced substantially. For made you do something sexual that you did not want to do, this reduced from 30% of women saying that this happened before the programme to none in the latter 3 months of the 9 to 12 months after starting the programme. Similarly, for used a weapon against you, this reduced from 29% before the programme to 0% also 12 months after starting the programme. Tried to strangle, choke, drown or smother you, punched, kicked, burnt or beaten you. This went down from around about half or just over doing this before the programme to 2% afterwards. Slapped you, pushed you, threw something at you, down from nearly all of the men using this before, 87% down to 7% afterwards. Threatened to kill you, somebody close to you, a similar reduction. Still a reduction, but not as pronounced. Punched or kicked walls or furniture, slammed doors, smashed or things or stamped around. Still a reduction, but not as substantial as the other one. So this pattern that you're beginning to see here is the pattern which goes throughout our research findings. So the more direct the physical or sexual violence was, using a weapon, strangling, punching, slapping, those types of behaviours were more likely to reduce and reduced far more substantially than more indirect forms of violence and abuse. So threatened to kill, being violent towards things around you, punched or kicked walls, etc. Still a massive reduction, but not to the same extent as the direct physical and sexual violence. And this pattern continues throughout all of the slides. So when we look at the use of harassment and abuse, we still continue to see very strong and consistent decreases. So something like did things that scared or intimidated you, this dropped by over half. Nearly all of the men doing this at the start, 90% down to 41% after. Belittled or humiliated you, 69% down to 27%. Insulted you, made you feel bad about yourself, dropping by about half. Deliberately interfered with or damaged your property, starting off at 64% down to 9%. And you see that similarly for the latter two indicators. So what we see is this consistent pattern that all of them are reducing, which is really positive. Nearly everything that we looked at reduced substantially, but not to the same extent as we saw in terms of physical violence. So if I just flick quickly back to that previous slide so that you can see the difference in the two blues, we see there lots of difference between the pale blue and the royal blue. We flick back to this slide and we see still big decreases, but not so substantial. We asked the women about self-perceived safety. How safe do you feel? We think this is a really important question to be asking women when we're looking at things like risk. And we see that before the programme, around about 60-70% were saying that they felt not safe at all or a little unsafe, and that by the end of the programme, we find that 80% are feeling somewhat safe or very safe. So we looked at how these changes were actually happening in our qualitative interviews with the men and the women. And Felix, in his second interview, so near the end of the programme, he said, well, when I spoke to you, I'd say things like it's only a push, but I've learned that a push is still violence. It's not just me, a lot of the others who say, well, I only pushed her to get out the door, but I've learned on the course that a push is still like as bad as a punch or a slap or whatever. Similarly, somebody who we call Matthew says, how I am around her, what words I use, how I treat her, my tone of voice, how controlling I am. These are things that I thought were little, but they're huge. I thought that's what every bloke did, and it's just not. And we saw both from the men and the women in some cases where they were saying that, yes, the violence had continued, but still their life was better because of reductions. And this is again something that wouldn't have featured as any form of success in some other study designs, because the violence was continuing, but often it was to some extent better, even if it's just marginally better. So Simon explains there's been 3 times over 6 months where it's been what he calls majorly aggressive or abusive. Before the course, it was once a week. Similarly, Alice says, I think there has been both still, quite a lot of verbal abuse and at times, but much more seldom physical aggression. I would say both of them have reduced, physical aggression especially. How did they do this? What sort of things did the programs do? Mainly 2 methods in particular that we saw were particularly taught across the programs and seemed useful. One called positive self-talk, which we're in the process of preparing an article on, which encourages men to talk in their own heads to themselves around not escalating a situation, about seeing other people's points of view instead of going down a negative spiral, and also time out techniques, again, which we have a paper forthcoming on this topic. So for example, Ken said things like breathing, counting down from 10, something so simple I wish I could have done it years ago. Similarly, Hazel describes when her partner took a time out to avoid using physical violence. So she says there's only been 2 incidents that I can recall where he's been physically violent, where he's pushed me and not letting me get out the kitchen door. And when it's like that, I'll just back down, and once he realises he's done it, once he's pushed me, he stands back, he knows he's overstepped a mark. Whereas before he started the course, he wouldn't know that. It's a massive difference. And then he will take himself out. On those 2 occasions, I didn't even need to say time out. He says, I need a time out, I'm going. And he was gone. So this example of Hazel, she's seeing it as a big improvement, even though the violence has continued, because she's saying at least now he knows that what he's done is wrong. It may not be the improvement that we're hoping for by the end of a programme, but for her it is still an improvement of sorts. We looked at things like respectful communication, and again, I'm not going to read all of these out, but I just wanted to show that when we look at the more subtle forms of coercive controlling behaviour, we see less decreases than we did if you think back to that slide on physical and sexual violence. So again, all of these are going in the right direction. All of these are improvements, but just not to the same degree as we saw for the physical and sexual violence. What a lot of the women said in our What Counts as Success study was they just wanted to be able to have a normal argument. They wanted to be able to put their view across. And this was some of the things that we did find improvements in by the end of the programme. So somebody who we call Bart says, I think she does feel more comfortable being able to respond back to me. At the programme, we talk about the pyramid of power. I was probably sitting at the top and things are now a bit more equal. His partner hopefully feels that pushback now without me going off the handle and getting abusive. Similarly, Hilary says, I was just constantly on edge because he was like a ticking time bomb. He could just, the slightest thing, he would fly off the handle. So I never felt totally relaxed and comfortable. I was frightened to open my mouth and say it's sunny outside or something normal. Frightened to say it because he would have kicked a table, put the hole in the wall or something. And looking at de-escalation techniques as well. So Sebastian explains, this is an example of what I was saying about positive self-talk. He says it's like recognising the volcanoes, the feelings and the emotions that build up like an explosion. So you're not getting to that level, you're keeping yourself low, you're not allowing yourselves to get to the higher points where you would explode if it got heated. So we also looked at freedom, about women's expanded space for action. And we looked at things like whether women felt that they were walking on eggshells, whether other controlling tactics were being used in the relationship. And again, we see that for every single one of these measures, things have got better. There is an improvement in all of these measures. In some of them, it's fairly substantial. So things like tries to restrict where I go, that's a reduction from 64% to 21% of the women saying that this at least sometimes happened before compared to afterwards. Prescribes or criticises the way housework is done, 55% down to 16%. This is an indicator which we think actually is really important in terms of looking at masculinity and how men act out the role of being men within relationships. Similarly, tells me to change the way I dress or my appearance. We also think this is a really important indicator as well. And this reduced down from 57% to 13%. Insists on knowing where I'm doing, where I am, what I'm doing, tries to prevent me from seeing or contacting friends, family, tries to prevent me doing things outside the home. These are all things which perpetrator programs spend quite a bit of time working on, and this seems to be reducing quite substantially. Really interesting to see this one around tries to use finances to control me. Such a marginal reduction. We weren't expecting this, and unfortunately we didn't ask about money and finances specifically within our interviews. I wish we had. I think this is an area which is very much under-researched. If anybody out there is thinking about a PhD or a master's project, this is something I think that needs more research, how finances are used within a domestically abusive relationship. We don't know why this reduced so marginally compared to other controlling factor mechanisms. Two guesses. It might be that programs aren't doing enough around money and finances, maybe a knock-on effect, the fact that we don't have much research on it, so it's not being used very often explicitly, perhaps within programs. Or it may be that that because people were separated or separating, sometimes when the programme was ongoing or after the programme, it may be that finances are one way in which an ex-partner can more readily still control women and children. So it may be those explanations, it may be something else. It's something that we do need more research on. But what I want to say about this slide is that it follows that same pattern. The reductions are all going in the right direction, but they're not as pronounced as we saw for physical and sexual violence. And what we found sometimes was women being very, very insecure about being able to test this newly found freedom. So there may be a partner who's kind of saying, I've changed, things aren't the same, you are free to do these things. But in fact, this really does show the need for long-term women's support, because it wasn't as easy to do that. It wasn't just kind of, well, the bubble's been lifted, I'm now going to, release my wings and fly off and be free, because they'd spend a lot of time not being free. And Jill, for example, says now, I think he gets frustrated with me because I've got so used to being in and not doing anything and not mixing people because I can't be doing with the arguments. Now he's actually saying, well, you need to go out, meet up with your friends, you need to get out more. And I'm kind of, well, I can't be bothered, I'll do it tomorrow or something. I've got so used to being a hermit, and you get anxieties and you don't even realise that they are there. Similarly, Sophie shows just how controlled her time and her movements were before the programme. Had to go shopping with him because otherwise it would be timed. How long have you been? Where have you been? Been up to nearby town? Once we were decorating the bedroom, ran out of paint. Went for some paint, and I just called into Asda because it was his birthday the week after. The only opportunity I could get him something without him being there, because even calling in late from work, he knew what time I was due in, and even if I was 5 minutes late aren't you? So I called in, I just pulled the car up on the front, and he was sat on the wall with a cup of tea. Just looked like my dad, like I was 12 years of age and I'd come in late. So although we're seeing less pronounced reductions, these may have had and did have major impacts on the way that women were able to live their lives, at least in theory, afterwards. Similarly, Jessica says, I think I've still got that issue with pulling back all the time. I think it's probably more me, too scared to take that first step to see if it's how hot it is from last time, because there hasn't been an occasion where I've been on a night out or where I've been alone with my friends. So I think that's something I'm going to have to do to take a step forward and see if our relationship can move on to that. Or if I do go out, is he going to react in a normal way that every normal partner should react? So this is another thing to kind of bear in mind when considering our findings, that often women were still fearful to use this newly found freedom in case it didn't really exist at all. They were scared of testing it in case it didn't really exist, and they were scared about going back to kind of living like that, or they were scared that in fact the relationship was going to be over if he hadn't changed, and they were scared about testing that, obviously. We looked at awareness of impact on self and others, but this was a tricky one because we did all of this through the women. So it was tricky because we were asking the women, do you think he understands the awareness of the impact of self on others? So in terms of kind of quantitative research, this isn't a very good way of measuring this indicator. So we saw marginal decreases, marginal improvements in this. But again, it's tricky because we were asking women whether they felt that their partner did this. So things like perpetrator blames me for his abusive behaviour. She may feel that he did that and he might say something else. So we see reductions, but it wasn't. Again, it was a more problematic area of our methodology. Similarly, we asked the women things like whether he asks me or talks about how his behaviour affects the children. So we saw a reduction there. I think domestic violence perpetrator understands the impact his behaviour has on his children. All of these seem to be improving, but again, we must treat these with some caution because we're looking at the women's interpretation of what the perpetrator was thinking, feeling. And some of the things that we found was that in the qualitative interviews with the men, that they certainly did seem to be thinking more about other people, what we call less all about him. So Justin, in his second interview, kind of said, I thought I was infallible till then. And Todd says, the thing is, I didn't care. I had no empathy with her. I couldn't give a shit how she felt. It wasn't my problem as far as I was concerned. And Sebastian, never even crossed my mind that the impact of my behaviour, the effect it had on other people, because I always had this thought that the king of the castle type person, and it never really crossed my mind until now. I was probably aware of it in the back of my head somewhere, but chose to ignore it. And in fact, when you speak to the women, they were far more kind and far more forgiving, actually, of the men's ability to know that the violence and abuse was creating problems for the whole of the family. So the women's interviews were much more likely to say, I don't think he knew, I don't think he understood, he'd had an abusive childhood himself, he'd just never learned. And in fact, in some cases, that's what the men were saying as well. But in other cases, they were saying, I did know that and I didn't care. So even Sebastian, who starts off in that statement by saying it never even crossed his mind, by the end of that paragraph is saying I was probably aware of it in the back of my mind somewhere, but chose to ignore it. So you look at Adele, who says, don't think he was aware at all. It was all about him. Elaine, he's incredibly self-centered. It's all about him. Grace, I don't think he did know. The taking over with the cooking and stuff, he thought he was being helpful, not controlling. I don't think he acknowledged the fact of me feeling about this big. I think he thought he was just having his opinion and that I wouldn't be affected by his opinion, that I wouldn't feel bad and I wouldn't feel affected. And Holly, again, I say that completely, genuinely, and I wholeheartedly believe that he never thought he was doing anything wrong, which may have been true in those cases. They're not the ex-partners of the ones in the previous, but if you just kind of contrast them and flick back to the previous slide, the thing is, I didn't care. I couldn't give a shit how she felt. I think there's certainly either two different things happening here or two different interpretations of how much awareness there is of this control. I'm just going to talk a little bit about the children's measures, and then I'm going to talk about how some of the change happened before we finish this presentation. So we looked at shared parenting because often, even when relationships were over, this was often why men were required to go on a perpetrator program. And this was one of the desires often for the women. They wanted their children to still have a good father, regardless of whether they were together or not. And they recognised that this contact in some shape or form, even if indirectly through children, was going to be continuing for a very, very long time. So for things like domestic violence perpetrator asks the children to report on what I'm doing, where I've been, attempts to get the children to take my side, in his side in disagreements, criticises me for a mother, blames me for the children's behaviour. All of these saw reductions, but ultimately I worry about leaving the children alone still stayed the same. This was a reduction, but it was less than 1%. So we just show it on the chart as staying the same. So some improvements, but nowhere near the significant shifts that we saw for the physical and sexual violence, or even for the more indirect forms of coercion and control. Much more minimal reductions, but possibly important ones. So we were particularly worried that the women still continued to worry about leaving the children alone. We looked within the interviews about how these, what we call steps to change. This is in fact the title of our research report, Steps Towards Change, because we're trying to say that in fact, some steps towards change may be better than none, and that even when we haven't got complete change around in behaviour, that steps are at least being made. So some of the steps that we saw being made was parenting styles improved, more attention to the children and communicating more with the children, more time playing with the children, an increased awareness of children's fears and anxieties around the impact that their behaviour might have had on their children. We did find within the research it was very difficult for men who had had very limited contact throughout their time on the programme to be able to demonstrate change to us in our research interviews. So if they weren't having contact, it was hard for them to put that into action. We think that's a bit of a problem actually in terms of the child contact cases, because the men were learning all of this throughout the programme, but they weren't able to put it into action during the week and come back and most of these programmes start with a thing called check-in, and they weren't able to say how the week had gone because they still hadn't had contact. So we think there's probably room for a kind of add-on session at the end for men who are there for child contact to continue their work on the programme while they're starting to have child contact again. So Ryan says, before I was always working, I was never there. Even when I was there, I wasn't really, sat on the floor playing with him. Dominic said, I never really listened. I was just nodding my head. My little boy used to have to put his hands on my face and turn me around to say, I'm talking to you, Dad. And when we look at safer, healthier childhoods, again, you see from the pattern of these graphs some improvements, but not the significant ones that we saw earlier. So probably if you look at the latter two as being perhaps the most linked to the perpetrator work. Do any of your children worry about your safety? We were asking the women whether they felt that their children did this. So again, there's a bit of a problem with our measure. We weren't asking in this part the children directly, although we have asked in elsewhere. about how safe the children themselves felt, and in fact all of them in that part of the study said that they felt safer, all but one to a very large extent. But in this question we're asking the mothers, do any of your children feel worried about your safety? This reduced from 64% before the programme to 37% 12 months after. Similarly, are any of your children frightened of the perpetrator? Again, it's the mother's perception. This reduced from 54% to 35%. So improvements, but not so significant as the ones that we saw earlier. The steps towards change that we saw within the interviews was a recognition that children were affected regardless of the age. This was a big one. Beforehand, a lot of the men were very keen to say, well, they were only a baby. And in fact, men talked about children still being babies up until they were about 3, 4, 5, far beyond what we would kind of class as the baby, but we didn't know whether this was part of the kind of the justification. Well, they were just a baby. They didn't know by kind of saying that they were a baby rather than a toddler or a young child. Recognising the climate of fear, responding to children's needs, and awareness of the ways that they'd control their children. The men in the qualitative interviews were more likely to report that change had happened than the women were, but again there was this concern about our design that some of the men hadn't had any contact with the child, so the women were understandably very anxious at this point about them applying for child contact and hadn't necessarily had the evidence yet that they had change. Just a few quotes here, Brendan saying, I think through the programme I learnt that he didn't have to be in the same room, he didn't have to be even in the same house and it would affect. Desmond, it didn't matter how old the bairn was really, still going to affect them. Stuart, of course it would have had an impact, still impacted on them. Again, this term, I didn't give a crap at the time, they didn't care. It wasn't just that they didn't know. In some cases, it was that they didn't know and they didn't care. Fred says, I think there's a lot of changes. Key to a lot of the impact that I was stubborn, I was controlling. My son is a bit frightened of me, a bit distant. I just need to give him a lot more attention. His needs come first, not my needs. And this awareness of how it's changed how other people respond. For Barry, he was on the front page of the local papers, and this affected many areas of his life, not just his family life, not just his private life, but also his friendships, people at work, etc., how people see him. So moving on finally to how this change happened. We were looking, in fact, for kind of light bulb moments. We were thinking, could we distill the programme? What would be the key points? What are the most important factors that the programme should be working on? And in fact, we didn't find this light bulb moment. We found a process that series of sparks which were different for each man, some of which didn't light up and some of which did. And this is also why we call it steps towards change. The steps that different men take are different in different situations. The sparks that start to light up and create the change, create that circuit of change, were different for different men. And it didn't just come as a light bulb, I've got it, eureka, aha moment. It came slowly. It came, well, maybe, well, yes, well, I see, well, and it was all of these little bits that built up to change. So Kieran says, I don't think there was a moment. During the programme, they all say the penny drops, this light bulb moment, and there never is. It's like a little fairground machine where you put a coin in and it bounces round little pegs. It's working its way to the bottom. The programme is like that. I know I'll be remembering it in my 70s and 80s, but it's never this light bulb moment. It's like a little coin that you drop in, it bounces around and it sort of argues with yourself, and all of a sudden, ding, it's in the bottom before you know it. We found, as I was saying earlier, that these techniques were important, particularly time out, positive self-talk. The length of the programme was important. Men talked about really needing time to absorb the content and needing time to decide that they wanted to change, to work out that there were going to be benefits from this. I didn't care. I didn't give a crap. This wasn't just about learning the effects. This was about deciding and the time that it took to decide that they wanted to change. And within this, the group work was really important, seeing oneself in others and being challenged by their peers. We found that men had very stereotypical notions of what it meant to be a man, a protector, a provider, the head of the household. In one of those quotes, somebody talked about being king of their own castle, fed into this sense that they knew best. Evan Stark's concept of the micromanagement of everyday life. Everything had to be about the way that they wanted things done because their way was best. And this remaking of gender relations was absolutely fundamental. This understanding and unravelling of male privilege and entitlement and learning how to be a man differently, a partner in a heterosexual relationship, and how to be a parent in a different way. So moving on to new challenges and questions in our conclusion. We learned a number of things about how we would do things differently in terms of methodology. The numbers going through some perpetrator programs are quite small. A lot of women obviously had a wish to move on and didn't want researchers ringing them every 3 months, asking them to report on their partner or ex-partner's behaviour. And this and other factors made creating a comparison group really, really difficult. We spent a long time trying to get a really good comparison group. We did the best that we could, and even that didn't work. We think there's room for a complete rethink actually around particularly the quantitative elements of domestic violence perpetrator program research and how ethical it is to make holding women's accounts the acid test in these circumstances. We think we're the first to use qualitative interviewing in such a large scale for research of this nature internationally. And in fact, this was really important because it did yield new insights about how men changed, and also in some cases how women changed as well, how they were able to act differently because they knew that the man was on a programme, because they had this kind of safety net around them of other people knowing what was happening, and that often empowered them to act very differently within relationships as well. New challenges and questions for domestic violence perpetrator programs, work on consistency in the amount of work that they have on parenting and the impact on children. We think there's room for more innovation on how to shift coercive control, because it was the more subtle elements that were more resistant to change in some circumstances. We think there's more work around men who are accessing programs because of child contact, and those who are seeking change within a relationship. These men have different motivations and needs, and the support that their female partners need from the women's safety workers is very different as well. Women's services need more investment to be able to innovate in this different type of work they need to do, and also long-term support, so that even if a man has changed, that they feel empowered, they feel able to kind of use this newly found freedom. And obviously direct services for children were lacking throughout nearly all of the programmes that we looked at. There's new challenges and questions for policymakers and commissioners as well, where men are doing this in terms of contact proceedings, which was a very large number of men. Should they be continuing their attendance on a programme once they begin supervised contact, so that weekly check-in continues when they've actually got something to check in, when they're actually putting what they've learnt into practice? And in terms of CAFCAS, an apology is required to children. Why not to mothers as well? And will this desire that we're seeing within the UK for shorter and cheaper programmes lose precisely what men talked about in our research as being really important for enabling them to change, in terms of making steps, in terms of them deciding that they wanted to change, in terms of kind of all of these little dinks, these coins dinking around and really engaging and lighting up and sparking up different parts of themselves and different motivations in different men? Will this kind of more instrumental tick box, we've done the children's session, we've done the session on emotional abuse, will this play into the approach that so many men start this program with, by thinking, well, I'll finish the program, I'll be done, I'll have changed, and that they get onto the longer programs and realize that it's not as simple as that. But will a shorter and cheaper program exactly tie into these initial motivations? Okay, that's the end of my presentation. Thank you for listening if you've reached this far. Electronic copy of this report and of other Project Mirabal reports are available on our website. Everybody is very welcome to join our Durham University Centre for Research into Violence and Abuse. We take community members as well as people from within different universities. It would mean that you get invited to different talks that we put on and you become a member of our research centre. So if you're interested in hearing more about the work of the Durham Centre for Research into Violence and Abuse, do get in touch and we can put you on the mailing list. Thanks very much.
Audioclicks. Be heard.